Alright, in this video we're going to be walking through the process of setting up a MIDI device in GeoPix 1.0, and for this tutorial we'll also be using an APC40 Mark II, which is a pretty common board and a great board. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is go up to Tools and open up the MIDI Manager, and you'll notice that I have the APC40 Mark II already here in the list, but if you have your MIDI device off when you start GeoPix, it's going to look something like this, where you don't have anything in the table except for this default Microsoft GS Wave table. So what you want to do is turn on your MIDI controller and hit the refresh button up here, and it should show up in the list if everything goes correctly and your drivers are installed and up to date. And from here, the next thing we need to do is actually create a mapping for this device, because just because it's showing up here does not mean it's actually being used or referenced in GeoPix. So create the mapping and go ahead and choose your device for the input and the output. If you had more than one MIDI controller here, you could go ahead and add a second mapping, and you could choose it from the list as well, but we'll keep this simple and just work with one for now. So with this done, for the APC40 Mark II has a special mode that needs to be enabled that allows the LED feedback to work. So if you're using the APC40 Mark II, be sure to click this button again after you set it up here in the device mapping, and you'll see that this message shows up down here, and that is good, so we're good to go. If you just move a slider and hit a few buttons, you'll notice that we have these signals coming in through the table, which means we are fully configured and ready to go in the MIDI Manager. So we can close that, and there's two places currently that use the MIDI stuff here in GeoPix. The first one is in the I/O tab. So if you go over here to the left and you scroll down to the MIDI section, this is also a way to open the MIDI Manager, but in addition to that, we need to do a couple other things before we can see the MIDI showing up here in the bin. So first, let's go ahead and open the MIDI bin by clicking the MIDI tab. You can also click the Show Bin, and you'll have an empty bin here probably, and to kind of get this thing working so that you see your sliders and your buttons showing up, is you need to turn on Enable I/O MIDI. So once you toggle this on, your sliders and your buttons should show up as individual things here, and you're good to go. So let's go and import a slider. Let's go ahead and grab this one. Just click on it, and you can place it somewhere in the I/O graph. So I won't go into too much detail since this is definitely the territory for a different tutorial, but essentially you have a texture and a channel output on this node, and you can plug these into various things. So for example, we can go ahead and put down a ramp, maybe a composite, just to give you a quick and simple example. So if we go ahead and turn off the time and reset the phase, we can connect the channel output into the phase of the ramp, and we now have a ramp that's controlled via MIDI. You can also plug the texture, which is a black to white texture depending on what value you have, into the composite top, and then we can also plug this one into the other input, and then maybe we can choose difference, and now we'll have some blending going on as well. So a couple different ways you can use the MIDI textures, and that's pretty useful. So with that said, this is the I/O tab and the way you use MIDI here. The other place you can use MIDI in GeoPix is in the Perform tab. So you'll have a canvas here. If you right click, we'll just add a couple simple widgets for now. Again, this is a different tutorial on this area, so we'll just be covering the basics here. So a simple button and maybe a vertical slider, and you'll notice that these are dark gray, and the reason why these are dark gray is because they're not currently added to our I/O tab. I'm going to do that just so we can see a brighter UI Perform widget. So over here, go to widgets and just click these and add them like so, and we can kind of forget about this for now. If we go back to Perform, you'll notice that they're now full brightness and looking normal. And so now we can get on to actually mapping our MIDI to these UI widgets. So there's two ways you can do that. There's the easy way and the slightly more complex way, which is very manual. So I'll show you the manual way first, but the automatic way is very, very easy and works for most cases. So if you go down here to MIDI Mapper, it'll open up a floating window of your MIDI Mapper. But you can also open this down here at the bottom if you'd like a split screen view instead. So by default you should have an empty mappings list here, and so what you need to do is click the plus to add a mapping, And the mapping by default will be completely empty. There'll be nothing in it, not configured. So you need to click on it, and then the next thing you need to do is choose a target widget. In our case, we want to say drive this vertical slider whose name is v_slider_1. So we just need to choose that from the list, and if it was a widget that had more than one component, you'd see the slider name or the button name after it. But for this slider, we only have one subcomponent, so we can just pick that one. For the style, we want to choose a slider. This is the simplest mapping we can do. And then the next thing we want to do over here in the source channels is choose the MIDI channel we want to drive this with. So if we move our slider, you'll see this one moving right here, so we can just click on it to assign that. And so now you'll see that we have this slider moving with our MIDI knob. If we go ahead and unlearn all, this basically unlearns and disconnects any MIDI from driving it. As you can see, nothing's happening, and this blue bar is just a preview. When you have a lot of MIDI inputs here, it gets to be kind of crazy and you gotta scroll a whole lot. So what you can do is unlearn all if you have anything learned and click auto learn, and it's going to prime the auto learn system. So you can see up here, change MIDI values to learn, escape to stop. So if I just move the slider that I just moved, you'll see that it immediately learns that slider and it connects it. And this is probably the easiest way if you're going to set things up manually, because there can be, like I said, a lot of channels here and it can just be difficult to find the right one. For a slider, that's pretty much all you have to do. The LED feedback you can pretty much ignore unless your style is a button style. And so we'll go and do that next. Go and click the plus to make a new mapping. You can choose that mapping, and this time let's pick the button, which will be this one right here. And then we have a couple different modes. We're not going to get into set in this tutorial, but that's very useful for some cases. But let's say we want a momentary. It basically just match our physical buttons style as well. So momentary, and let's go and find a button on our MIDI controller, and this one looks good. So we can click on this. As you can see, we've mapped our button. Now you can't see this because I don't have a camera set up on the MIDI controller, but when I have this pressed down on my MIDI controller, it's bright green. When I release, it's like a teal or a blue, and so that's what these two MIDI control feedback color numbers mean. If you basically change these to anything else, and you can use the mouse wheel to adjust, you'll see this changing on your MIDI controller. And it basically gives you a different start and stop color, or an off and on color for that button. This is very useful for color coding your entire setup, so that if you have maybe some buttons or a radio group, for example, that you want to be red by default, you can do that. And then you can have another group of buttons or another single button whose off state is maybe blue or something else. So that's quite useful for basically setting up different schemes visually. And that's all you already need to know about the MIDI mapper. Now I'm going to show you how to map these two things without doing things the hard way. So we've cleared all of our mappings, and we have two buttons, nothing's mapped. What you can do is right click on a button, or a slider, or any widget for that matter, and it's going to give you a context menu of things that you can do. So you can delete all mappings associated with that UI widget, or you can map MIDI or map OSC. So for us, let's go ahead and map MIDI. And then it's going to ask us what kind of style, and we want to go ahead and do momentary. And now it's waiting for us to do the auto learn. So if we go ahead and hit the button on our MIDI controller, you'll see that we've now successfully mapped it. Same for the slider. If we right click, map MIDI, and do slider, we can just move our slider, and now we're good to go. If we pull up the MIDI mapper dialog here, you'll see that we've got two mappings that were made for us by the auto mapper, and we can configure those, change them, or delete them as we see fit. So that pretty much sums it up for this tutorial. That's how you map things in the Perform tab or in the I/O tab through MIDI. So that pretty much sums it up for this tutorial. Thanks.